Hello, North Country. Welcome back for another episode of Why Waite, Innovate. My name is Matthew Waite. I'll be your host for the next hour or so. As you know, our tag here at Why Waite, Innovate is to highlight North Country activists, organizers, innovators working to move our region forward. We have one of those very individuals in studio today, Vrinda.
Hello.
So, Vrinda, thank you so much for joining the show. We're just going to do a little bit of background first. Vrinda's very active and visible on SUNY Plattsburgh campus. She's former president of the Student Association, which is student government. She's earned a Bachelor of Science from SUNY Plattsburgh in public health. She's an international exchange student from Dubai, UAE, United Arab Emirates. She's also an Indian citizen, so we're thrilled to have her with us here today to talk about the issues of mental health in general and how they may be exacerbated by environmental factors such as a different culture, language, etc. So I'm very interested to have a different perspective here in studio. So thanks so much for joining us, Vrinda.
Thank you for having me. I think this is amazing, and I appreciate that you're doing this with different individuals here.
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to get as much of a diverse background as possible.
For sure.
So a lot of our individuals here on the show have been North Country residents. I believe that you are a transplant to the area. So let's get into a little bit more of your background. Can you tell us a little bit about where you're from?
Yeah, that's like, I ask myself every day this, but in short, I was born and brought up in Dubai, UAE, but I am an Indian citizen, as you mentioned. I was brought up in an Indian culture, and then I came here about 5 years ago for my bachelor's, and now I'm doing my master's. I'm in my first year. So I am from Dubai, but I was strongly brought up in an Indian culture, and now I'm here.
So I think this is going to set a record. I mean, about halfway around the world. Is that about right?
Basically.
Well, get as far away from as you can from Plattsburgh, and you're going to find yourself in probably about the Middle East. So tell our listeners, who I'm guessing very few of them are familiar with Dubai, a little bit about what it's like growing up in a place like that.
So Dubai is, you could think of, Manhattan in some areas, and then in some areas, just like any other place, it's a little less developed, but it's definitely known for being a really glamorous, shiny city with, everything is like the tallest and the biggest and the best. So it's very, it's a great tourist spot. I personally am more interested in activism and just being able to help different communities and everything. So it wasn't necessarily for me in those realms, but for people who are, who want to visit and who want to just travel around and see different cultures, it's a big metropolitan area. So that's Dubai basically in a nutshell.
Okay, so I think this may be apt, maybe not, but it seems like as far as the shiny things, like maybe Las Vegas, they're trying to just kind of make a big splash and be an entertainment center of Asia.
Yeah, definitely. I think they've done well in that realm. Like, they're very known for that. It has one of the biggest malls, the tallest towers, and all of those things. So,
Airport
is like a mall. Yeah.
All right. And so about how long does it take you to get here? A couple planes?
A lot of motivation. And like 24 hours of traveling. And yeah, it's a long flight.
Okay. So
24 hours including the, transit and everything. If it's a direct, it would be like 14 hours.
Yeah, so it takes some time to get here.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm interested in knowing, what's the culture like? I mean, growing up education-wise, what were you doing in high school? How different was it from, obviously you didn't go to high school here, but you've probably gotten a little bit of idea of how high school has been through your colleagues at SUNY Plattsburgh. So
yeah, I think also there's a strong Western influence in Dubai, so you're always seeing, hearing things, movies, music. I think one of the notions is that it's really different, or things here is very different from back home. I don't think that's necessarily true. I mean, we are taught I went to a school which the language was English, and yes, so we had uniforms. It was a British school, so it was a lot of British-led curriculum and things like that. But they're different schools. So if there's a school which is more focused on American Americanized education, so that's available also. And I would say even for India, it's the same sort of dynamic where depending on which school you go to, the culture is totally different. So I went to a school where English was taught. We had a lot of extracurricular and, basically not that different.
Okay, well, yeah, one of the things I was going to say about you is that you seem to be very much comfortable and getting out there. I don't know, hopefully I can just put this out there, but,
Yeah.
Going to University at Buffalo, there's a large Asian population, a little bit more far Asian population. I tended to notice that some of the students were maybe a little bit more closer to the vest. They were a little shy maybe in certain circumstances, and you seem to be very comfortable and put yourself out there. Do you think that had to do anything with the Western influence? Maybe, I think in the United States we tend to not be very shy, about pretty much everything. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean...
Yeah, Asia. So the thing with that is that Asia is just a really big continent. So within Asia, there's different subcultures. There's different populations. It's the biggest continent in the world. So it's hard to speak for different cultures. But I can just say that in my school, in my upbringing, there was a focus on getting your voice heard. And speaking out, and public speaking was taught also. So I really think it's a mix of both. Of course, I mean, just, in theory, coming or traveling all the way here would have to make someone a little bit more comfortable with putting yourself out there, because that's what happens when you make that big transition. So I think it's a mix of both. I think SUNY Plattsburgh and just my education here helped a lot. It definitely helped a lot with just talking to different people from different countries and listening and having different mentors. So it was a mix of everything.
Let's get into the transition then.
Yeah.
So at some point in high school or shortly thereafter, you probably decided what's next. You had to kind of think, what am I going to do?
Right.
When did international study come onto the radar? Was that something you always kind of wanted to do, or did it develop slowly over time?
I always wanted to study somewhere else just to get a different perspective. I knew I was familiar with what was happening in Dubai, or somewhat of what was happening in India. So I knew I wanted to just go out to the west and see what's happening over there. I come from a very collectivist culture. There's a lot of focus on community and what's best for everybody, as opposed to what's best for just you. And then Western culture is influenced by individualism. I don't think there's anything wrong or right in both. I think both has its pros and cons. So I just wanted to get out of my own comfort zone and see how it is here. And then, the chips fell into place. Scholarships worked out, connections worked out, and I got a lot of help financially from this institution and then people back home, and then I was able to make it here.
Great, yeah. So you answered my next question, which was why Plattsburgh. So just the financials and everything else worked out, the logistics and...
Yeah, and it was completely different from what I was used to in terms of, obviously, the weather. Unfortunately, I couldn't bring any of it back here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, maybe you are now, because we're getting into spring. But to your point,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure I can imagine anything more different.
Right.
I mean, we're talking about winters and mountains, and
Yep.
from what little I know about Dubai, pretty flat, fair to say.
Yeah, very. In fact, we have the only skiing or snow I've ever seen or done when I was back home was in an indoor park where they made fake snow. And that's my experience with snow before coming here. So I was like, yeah, if I really want to put myself out there and grow, I think the best way to grow in any situation is facing the thing that you're most uncomfortable with in proper dosage and with proper mentorship, obviously. But so that's what I was looking for, to challenge myself. And I think I'm privileged that it all turned out well, and I'm here now.
Yeah, so I think our listeners will probably get a little idea into where you are now when you mentioned dosage and things of that nature.
Yeah.
So your major was in public health. You've got a degree now, so I think you referenced you've been here about 5 years, a little bit more maybe. So you've already checked off the Bachelor of Science.
Yeah.
Now you're working on your, is it a master's program?
Yeah, so 4 years of bachelor's and now finishing my first year up in mental health and counseling, which is, I think, the best thing I've ever done for myself.
Yeah, why do you say that?
So many reasons. I think it's really such a new sort of awareness is happening with mental health, and I love to be part of change. I think that the growing opportunity for mental health is good. It's not where I want it to be, but I would like to be part of a solution. I think, you see gyms really common here everywhere. Wherever you go, it doesn't matter which country it is, for the most part, you'll see a gym, a relatively cheap membership. So everything is about mostly taking care of your physical self, working out, eating right. But we don't really talk about mental health as much. And that's what I wanted to change, and that's why I got into the program. I've had my own struggles with mental health, so it was a win-win, because not only did I focus the first semester on figuring my own things out, there was an opportunity given to me, and now I can help, or be a catalyst for others to figure their things out if I'm afforded the opportunity. But yeah, I think there's not one thing I regret in this program. I feel like at least the first semester felt like I was majoring in my own life because of the amount of reflection you have to do. So, yeah.
I think you're hitting on something very important, though,
Sure.
in obviously part of your discipline is to help others. So
Sure.
you've obviously had something within you that you just, maybe it's the collectivist
Sure.
nature in which you were raised.
Yeah.
But you want to do something for other people. But in doing something for other people, it's also a gift to yourself. And that's what you're coming to realize, is that
sure.
by giving advice to other people, you're kind of also self-reflecting, and it's helping you figure out your own mental health issues and what you need to work on. And so talk a little bit about the role of mental health, because I think I'll just make a small little note here in, I think, how quickly things are changing. And
Sure.
so listening to a podcast, Tim Ferriss, I think it was, mentioned that even physical health,
Yeah.
taking physical health seriously, and you mentioned the gyms everywhere, that's actually a fairly new development within like the last 80 to 100 years in
Right.
Western culture, to my understanding, is that there weren't a whole bunch of gyms or jogging. It's a fairly new thing, and it's kind of crazy to think about that even 100 years ago. Today, we're seemingly so obsessed about our health and wellness, physical health and wellness. It's taken tremendous jumps very quickly. I think what I'm seeing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we haven't really made that jump or that innovation into the realm of mental health yet.
Yeah.
But I think what we're going to talk about today is we're starting to see bits and pieces and some innovation that we're starting to feel it's starting to become much more into the center of American culture, and we're starting to realize that we have to talk about these things. Are you seeing that?
Definitely. And in fact, I think with mental health, especially if I'm studying counseling. So one thing to be sure of is that first you figure everything out for yourself, and then you can be help to others. Because I think one thing about mental health and just counseling in general is that if there's a lot of research done on why people get into that field, and a lot of it also has to point towards, you want to help others. Yes, that's great, but I don't know if you can necessarily be responsible for helping someone completely. I think I am more of an existentialist, and I like to believe that it has to be both ways. And with regards to physical health, I think I was just also referring to how normalized it is, or at least I think it is, to talk about how many times in a week do you go to the gym, or when you're ordering food and you say no cheese or something. It's very normalized in those cases. But when it comes to mental health, how often do we talk about, hey, so I'm going to therapy tomorrow, or you should, also my counselor is great, do you want to get an appointment with this person? It really doesn't happen, because there's this notion that if you're going to counseling, there's something wrong with you. And I'm not trying to challenge or compare physical health with mental health, because a lot of it is tied. It's so tied, as we know. If you're not feeling well, obviously you're not going to think the best you can. So it's more of a, how can we bring these two things together in a holistic approach versus compete one with the other. So I just want to live in a world where someone can talk about, hey, I'm going to therapy, or I'm taking medication, or I'm not doing too good today, and that's fine, because we all can't always be happy, and happiness isn't a commodity, it's more of an intrinsic thing. And I don't know if I'm going too philosophical into this. I think I love philosophy, so that's one aspect. But yeah, I would say if we could just normalize mental health as much as we do with physical health, that's something where I envision this going.
No, that was absolutely perfect. And a couple things I want to untangle out of that, because
Sure.
you did hit on a couple of things that are part of themes that have been running either with my podcast or with, we also have Nick Dubé. We want to give a shout out to Nick Dubé, has a mental health
Yeah.
podcast.
Yeah, it's
and
amazing.
he brings up this fairly regularly, the whole metaphor of the empty cup. You can't fill a vessel from an empty
Exactly.
vessel. And I think that's what you're saying.
Exactly.
In order for even yourself to be able to be the best counselor that you can be,
Yep.
you've got to make sure that you got your own
Yep.
stuff taken care of.
Very true. Very true.
And then the other thing, I think I couldn't have said it better about ending the stigma, and because we do in this country, we have that stigma that you mentioned. Oh, I'm going to get therapy. Well, what the heck's wrong with that dude, right?
Yep.
But at the same time, if someone's saying, that I'm going to the gym, people aren't like, well, what the heck is wrong with that dude?
Exactly.
He's got 10 pounds overweight. We should be talking. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think that's what you're getting to, and I couldn't agree with you more.
Right.
That we have to take a look at all of this more holistically, and not just look at one thing here or there and have this stigma where we try and other people, because
Right.
we all have mental health issues.
Yeah.
Even the most healthy person deals with things, and
Yes.
most likely they are the most healthy person because they have addressed those issues, and because they are seeking help, and
Yeah.
they're always working on self-improvement.
Really well said. I completely agree with that, and I'm happy that Nick and people are doing things in the community to address mental health. And I just it's mental health. It's not necessarily visible. So if someone is going through depression, PTSD, you necessarily can't see it. So for that person to go through all of those things and still be able to, work, do their thing, it's extremely hard, and that's an understatement. Because let's say I have a fracture on my arm. On my left arm. So nobody's going to really expect me to work my left arm. If I need things, they might help me, open doors for me and things like that. Because they can see that there's something, I'm injured and I need some time to heal.
It's pretty obvious.
Exactly. But that's not true necessarily with mental health, because there's the stigma, so people don't want to necessarily disclose. Because why would they? Because there's that whole, either you're, in quotes, crazy, which is another term that I absolutely disagree with. And then there's the, what is wrong with you, or what's happening is this. So yeah, that's where I'm trying to also get at. Just as it's okay to go to a doctor or get a Band-Aid and, take care of symptoms, it's also okay to go and do your own mental health work, whether that's therapy, which I'm a strong advocate for, whether that's meditation. There's so many forms of that. And I know you were talking also about self-care. I think another thing with self-care is that we think self-care is just one thing. So some people would say, like bubble baths and, wine and everything, and although, those things are great.
In moderation.
In moderation, exactly. And also, sometimes self-care is discipline. Sometimes self-care is putting yourself out there and going and seeking therapy, even though you have all these things that are telling you not to go, or all this stigma and culture that's telling you not to do it. Sometimes self-care can be the hardest thing to do,
Yeah, I'm interested to know if there are any differences in how mental health is, and the taboo and the stigma that we talk about culturally.
Yeah.
East versus West. What have you noticed?
So that's actually one of the... So in our program, we learn a lot about cultural stigmatization of mental health. And I think you bring up a good point, because it's really dependent on what your culture is and how you were brought up. So for me, I was brought up in a community-based culture. So if I had something going on, I would be able to disclose it to my sister, my mom, a couple of friends that I trust, and we would sort of work through it together. So one thing when we see in research about depression and just mental health in general is that isolation is not only a symptom, but it's also a cause. Sometimes when you're if you feel like you have to do everything by yourself, that leads to something, that leads to pressure, that leads to, self-talk, which is negative. So for me, being brought up in a community-based culture, I think I was privileged in that realm, because this way I was more open to therapy, more open to community-based meditation groups, more open to going to a religious institution, even if I don't identify with the religion. So, I would go to churches and things like that. So in that aspect, I think community-based cultures are also, they help with mental health. But that was my experience. I obviously, this whole time, I can only talk about my experience. There are other cultures where mental health is stigmatized and they are community-based. But I think just being able to rely on a bunch of people helps to destigmatize and helps you to move forward.
Yeah, very well stated. I mean, I love that we're hitting on a couple of themes that we've come across before. So one I like to say is, one of my favorite quotes is, if you can talk about it, you can manage it. And I think that's one of the things we're looking to do with mental health, is we need to be more open to having those conversations. Sure. Because if you can talk about it, you can manage it.
Sure.
Your point on isolation, I brought this up a couple of times because I've been very active with the Spark Coalition, which is trying to combat the opioid epidemic that we're dealing with here. And there's one author who's come across some of my research and is really pretty convincing to me. His name is Johan Hari, and he's got 2 books, Chasing the Scream and Lost Connection. And his theory is, yes, there's definitely chemical hooks in these drugs that are addictive and are creating, people who have predispositions, biologically or otherwise, can get addicted because of these hooks that the drugs have. However, the larger point, and I think what I'm hearing from you, is that a lot of the times it's actually more of having to do with isolation and losing connections. And people, at times when they feel isolated and depressed, if they don't have someone to reach out to help them through that, it's very easy to drug yourself, to anesthetize yourself, to kind of lose yourself in that. And I think that's what we're seeing. So I think that you're also seeing a little bit of that in the clinical side, or at least where you want to be practicing in the clinical side.
Yeah, I did a year of research with substance abuse and how it relates to mental health. And that's another thing I would like to, invite people to consider, is that if you're going to ostracize someone and just demonize them, they're not going to feel comfortable to come up to you and talk about what they're going through. Substance abuse is a huge issue. There's a huge opioid epidemic, but there's also factors that play into it. Socioeconomic status, if someone's not earning too well, then how much does therapy cost? How much does drugs cost? How much does alcohol cost? Now put in, let's say they have to take care of a family. Do they have time to seek therapy, especially in a place where there's limited access to mental health? So I think we have a tendency to be like, okay, this is mental health and now this is substance abuse. I think that it's connected, because the pain is so much and the outlet is so little that, people who, get addicted to substances, they really feel like they're alone in this and they don't have a choice. And I know everybody, so yes, using first and everything, at the end of the day, some people will be like, yeah, but everything is a choice. Everything is a choice. But there's enough research to now talk about how substances change the brain wiring, neuroplasticity, and, it's just like if you call someone a name, if you curse at them, how are you going to understand what they're going through? How are you going to open up a dialogue? So even if you don't agree with substance abuse being a disease, you really need to first see if you're doing your own research and taking in the facts and talking to people who are addicted, and not demonize them. It's really easy to not be going through something and then just name it as you think it is. It's easy for me to sit here and just be like, yeah, let's talk about like cancer. Cancer must be hard and stuff like that. That's because I know from, reading and listening to people and doing my own research and just how much awareness is about that physical disease. But I've never gone through it. So how do I know about it? Because you read, you listen. So yeah, that's something that it's really unfortunate and it's really isolating with substance abuse. So I think that if anything, if you want to combat opioid crisis, we need to open up mental health facilities in terms of therapy and whatnot and just normalize that people go through things every day.
And access to healthcare, right? I mean, I think
Yeah.
that's one of the things you're talking about is there
For
can
sure.
be some socioeconomic factors
Yeah.
that I honestly hadn't probably thought about that much. And,
Yeah.
there's a saying that I have being a public defender, indigent defender, being poor is expensive.
Yes.
And I
Very
don't think that's
nicely
something
said.
we talk about that very
Exactly.
often, about how,
Exactly.
if you have to take a cab places versus having your own car, that,
Yes.
we could go into a lot, but there's a lot of different
Sure.
factors here. And that's why I love the holistic approach that you're
Yeah.
trying to take and taking a look at everything. And, as someone who's been in the United States for a while, I think we were kind of talking at the outset about, the public health here. We got some work to do.
Yeah.
And I think that's one thing we'd like to see. And, I don't want to get too much on my soapbox, but I would like to see much more access to services, Medicare for all. I don't know how we get there, but I think we definitely need to take a much more active role at how we fund mental health. Because I think when we talk about GDP and economics,
Yeah.
the thing that makes a society the most productive is having healthy and productive people.
Exactly.
And I hope we can get there. And obviously, let's hope that it moves a little bit. But speaking of moving a little bit, let's get a little bit more into the meat and potatoes of mental health and what you're currently doing. So you are now in a graduate program.
Yes.
What are you learning now in a graduate program that you find so interesting and that you're really looking to practice as soon as possible?
I think it'll be easier to say what I'm not learning because I'm learning a lot. I'm learning, like you pointed out, about the barriers of therapy and why people can't access it as opposed to why they don't want to access it. How it's a privilege, how self-care is more than, what we talked about in terms of indulging in foods and baths and wine and all those things. There's also, just recently, I think the most important thing I've learned so far for me is the book The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. It's not a mandated book, but we are always encouraged to read things about mental health. So it talked about the pain body in all of us and how it feeds into us, and so how negative thinking can be an addiction, and an addiction that is really that needs help, and that it's hard to get away with. So it talked about how if you see, there's a lot of people love positivity, right? They like to be drawn to positive people. They like to be drawn to people who are like funny and energetic and things like that. But what do we do when someone is not doing so well? We understand that someone is being negative or down on themselves because that's what they've known, and that's what they're used to, as opposed to how they are with you. It's less about you and more about them. So not taking things personally when it comes to interactions is another important aspect. So yeah, there's a lot. I could go on and on and on about what I've learned, but I think if there's anything that I really didn't think of is the addiction to a certain way of thinking and feeling.
Yeah, well stated, and I think we have to perhaps have a much broader view of addiction too.
Yeah.
And I think to your point, sugars and other things, social media, negativity, all these things can be addictive. And I think I've noticed that, as I get older, hopefully we all self-reflect a little bit. And I think one of the problems I had is the harder points of my life, I was overly negative, and I would, probably latch onto that. And what I've been saying recently, as I've become much more optimistic, is I very much see negativity, as I say, there's not a whole lot of positive utility you can get out of negativity.
Yeah.
There's very little extrinsic externalities that you're going to get out of that. However, positivity, you actually can have a lot of things. Being positive can very much just make everything else better. It can help your mood. It can elevate the way other people see you, right?
Sure.
So
Sure.
I don't know how we do it, but I think we do have to try and help to recalibrate our culture a little bit more toward positivity and try and figure out how to deal with the negativity a little bit more.
I would actually even like to talk about there's something I think such as toxic positivity. Now, if someone, let's say, if my client comes to me and says, well, this has happened to me. Let's say there's a death in my family. Now, I'm not going to respond with, well, people die every day. Let's just be happy. That is toxic. So I know like there's a lot of pros of being toxic, but positivity can fall in the realm of invalidation. There comes a time, there's even a positive approach to being, venting and being a little negative, or, well, not negative, I think constructive is the best word. So there's a time for all of it. It's a whole process. So you need to let your feelings out. You need to be able to feel validated that there's nothing wrong with feeling negative. There's nothing wrong with being negative. However, let's now take that as an invitation to growth. I think one of my professors says really well in an email recently. Dr. Deal talks about how we are, there's a difference between wanting to find relief and wanting to grow. Finding relief can mean sugars, substance, alcohol, and things like that, addictions. Finding to grow is that sitting with, wow, I'm really feeling bad about this. So why am I feeling bad about this? What does it mean to me? What kind of narrative have I constructed throughout my life where I'm just feeding into this pain body that is inside of me? And then how do we grow from it? So, there's pros and cons to both. I think that a happy medium is great. I think we don't have to we all tend to be negative. Things happen, and I think it's human to get down on yourself or things sometimes, and then take it somewhere else. So that's why.
Very well stated. I'm a spectrum person, so I tend to think that almost everything is a spectrum. And what you're saying is that even positivity, you can go way too far out on that spectrum and really lose yourself. And
for sure.
And also the negativity can be positive as well. Sometimes it's completely reasonable and rational and in fact healthy to be negative for if you have the right context around it.
And change the language, and I'm not being negative. I am just feeling bad because of this thing and that thing. And I'm going to let it out. And then once I let it out, I'm going to try to get help, or I'm trying to grow from it. It's a lot of hard work, and I want to put it out there that in no way I'm trying to minimize the experience or say that it's easy and let's just all, kumbaya and do this together. It's a lot of work. And there's a lot of socioeconomic things that play into how it's harder for some versus not that harder for some.
Yeah, and two things that I would like to say there. One is I think I've already referenced Tim Ferriss, an amazing podcaster, just a great interviewer. And one of the things he mentioned was that an author or someone he knows came up with this no complaining month or something, and with a little wristband that you wear, essentially like the live strong, be well, or whatever the cancer with the whatever that is. Anyway. I think our listeners get what I'm saying. So Tim Ferriss came across this guy who came up with an idea for wearing a band, no complaining. And if you complain, you have to basically turn the band over and start over again. And it's just a very it's a very interesting way of, I think he tried to tie it to mindfulness and being mindful of your mind all the time and trying to focus on not complaining. And he created a little caveat insofar as, well, you can kind of complain, but as long as you come out of it with, this is what I should have done better, or this is my takeaway, and this is how it's not going to happen again. I thought that was very interesting, and I'm kind of interested to try it because I think that would be an interesting experiment just to figure out how much I do complain, and I'm sure I would not be too shocked to find out that I complain more than I should or more than I would like to, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's a great idea. My only, and this is, it could just be me, is to not judge yourself when you get there, because that could be like complaining about complaining. Self-judgment is huge. We think about things and sometimes it's not the thing that we're thinking about, but just how we use it to judge ourselves. My approach, or at least what I'm trying to do, and I'm far from perfect from this, is that, okay, I have a negative feeling. It's there, and I'm trying not to empower it by feeding into it. Like think of it as a little cookie monster inside of you, that every time you judge yourself for being negative, or every time you think about something, you're just feeding into that cookie monster, and it's growing and it's growing. Mindfulness is huge. Meditation has definitely changed my life. I think being present is one of the biggest presents you can give yourself. I'm a huge advocate for puns.
Pun intended.
All the puns in that.
I think we'll get into another one later, but no, that was a well played pun.
Thank you.
And before I do want to segue into that a little bit, but just wanted to quickly note Amy Guglielmo, who's been on the podcast, and one of the things she says, to your point about complaining, is creative complaining. So if you do have a complaint, like you said, instead of maybe just trying to anesthetize yourself or to indulge in something that would make you feel better in the short term, but to actually think about it and to come up with some ideas for how you can make it better.
Right.
Like her, she's an artist looking at Plattsburgh. Well, we've got some good things going on, but we can make it better. We can have murals about town, and that was her outlet for complaining, creatively.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we need to do as a society, is to try and find more positive ways to. If you want to change the way the world is, that's great. But instead of just getting on Facebook and or having an angry blog or something, maybe there are other more creative outlets to do that.
Yeah. I think I think it's great that she was talking about channeling your energy into something that's more healthy for you, and healthy for each person is relative. I also read this thing about how your problem is also your solution. And in terms of, let's say, we were talking about negative thinking, right? I'm trying to get away from it, but it's not possible to get away from it when every time I think negative, I get down on myself and be negative on myself. So same thing with, like, think of it as anything. If you're trying to gain, let's say, more muscle, the hard part is going to the gym, right? I guess, because you have to go there
that's every
day. Right? I mean,
our viewers will know
that's what they say, right? So going to the gym, but then that's also something that you're tired of doing. So, but that's the solution. So that's what I was talking about with, like, at the start, with facing discomfort and then going from there. And that's what happens with mental health. If you want to change something, then I think constructively channeling your energy towards that change, whether it's outlets through art. I think art therapy is huge, music therapy is huge, whatever therapy works for you. But at the end of the day, doing it, we were also talking about, like, listening and, like, with community-based listening.
What's that now? I'm just
Good
kidding.
one.
I was actually making a note in my outline, but no, I to your point, I think listening, and we talked about this with Pastor Phil. It's something that we all need to do more of.
Yes, for sure. And then also, everybody stigmatizes. Not everybody. I would reframe and say that some people stigmatize mental health, but everybody wants to be a therapist. So let's say, okay, your friend is going through something, and then you say, well, get out there, just smell the air, face the sunlight, and everybody just becomes a therapist. That's not fair to yourself, because you're trying to be something that's a whole profession. You're taking away from my job. But you're also not necessarily giving the best advice. And even in the friend aspect, your friends will wish well for you and they mean well for you, but they don't have the answers. That's why professional advice is so important. That's why professional therapy is so important. One thing that I've heard also is that, well, I tried therapy and it didn't work for me, so I'm not going to do it anymore. And I can understand, I can empathize with that, because I myself have gone through like 2-3 therapists. But here's the thing, when you try, this is something Dr. Stone brought up, is that when you try cleaning product and it doesn't clean whatever you're trying to clean, I don't know. I'm pretty messy, so I don't bother. But whatever you're trying to clean doesn't get cleaned up with that product, you don't stop cleaning, do you? You don't, unless you're me, you don't just like live in a mess.
You try something else.
You try something else. You try a different therapy approach, a different therapist. So it's not easy. All of this is not easy, but it's necessary.
All right. I want to transition a little bit here. And I love what you said about art and music therapy. Mm-hmm. I think those things are great. And I do think having some cathartic outlet. I mean, actually, we were talking about this at the outset that one of the reasons I'm doing this, we're not looking to make a ton of money. We're doing this because I think it's a necessary conversation. I want to have the conversation. I don't think that there's enough of this.
Yeah.
So we're trying to fill in some voids and some gaps.
Right.
And that's why we're doing it, is for the I guess it would be for the intrinsic motivation. I'm doing it because it makes me feel good, and it's nice to talk about these things. Because like I said, if you can talk about it, you can manage it. And right. I think we're doing some really cool things. But, I mean, there's a lot I want to get into here. I mean, you mentioned neuroplasticity. Maybe some of our listeners may not be too familiar with this, but I guess where I want to go with this is the brain is extremely complicated, but it's also very resilient, too. And it is very adaptive. And I think that's one of the things, I don't want to nerd out too much on our listeners, but we're starting to find out a lot more through neuroscience. And one of my favorite podcasters is Sam Harris, who's a neuroscientist and actually has a podcast and a mindfulness app.
Right.
Wake Up is his recent book, and he's really trying to push this stuff of mindfulness, meditation. And I think to your point also about having stigma around this is we tend to look at some of these things as being all entirely negative, trauma and et cetera. And to a large extent, I think there's good reason for that. But I want to, I guess, transition a little bit into things like post-traumatic growth, which is something that we're talking about now.
Very nice,
and being, one of the most interesting, probably the most fascinating book I've read in the last 5 years is Anti-Fragile. And it's fascinating. It's by an economist, actually. And essentially the thesis is that we didn't really have a word up until recently for the opposite of fragile. And things, resilience, not quite the same thing. Things that actually get stronger when they're challenged and they're stressed.
Yeah.
And can you help move us into that direction of what you're seeing as far as therapy allowing for growth potentially and post-traumatic growth?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I come back to the like muscles. For example, if you're working them out, you'll have muscle tears at the start, but then you get sore the next day. What do people say when you're sore? Oh, that's bad. But this is how you know you're growing. This is how you know you have a good workout. That's what to put it just very simply, that's what happens with the brain. I mean, at first, all this sitting with your pain and all these mindfulness things are really hard, especially if you've never done this before. Going to therapy is hard. Facing these things are hard. Talking about it is hard, especially because people want to always, there's this whole thing of we need to be happy all the time. That's exhausting, Being in one state constantly is just exhausting. So that's how I think neuroplasticity, and I wish I could say that word better, but that comes up, if you do one thing over and over again, whether it's your muscle, whether it's your brain, which is a muscle, is that it'll change over time. It'll change. Give it time, and just be in control of your brain versus your brain being in control of you, if that makes sense. And just because something is hard at first doesn't necessarily make it bad. Yeah. Yeah,
no, I mean, Tim Ferriss, I mean, hopefully we can maybe get you on, but I'm going to give him another shout out because I just learned so much about the brain. And one of the things that I came across in listening to him actually on someone else's podcast was how much of our brain is doing things that we're not aware of. I think it's like a significant, like 5% or less of our brain we're thinking about it. We're actually like everything else is kind of just on autopilot. And I wasn't even really aware of that until listening to that. But I think that's kind of what you're talking about. And mindfulness can help because you can start to realize maybe some of the things that your brain is doing in order to help restructure itself, etc. Right. Anyway, there's a lot we can go into there. I did want to transition, though, into talk about losing control. Social media. This is something on two different levels. I think social media, this is the conversation I had with Nick Dubé. I think there's a lot of pitfalls, and maybe you can speak to that, social media. So on one aspect, a lot of negatives, right? I mean, social media, we talked about negativity. I think some of the things on social media for kids, I mean, I can't even imagine. I am 36. I think just missed, the whole like AIM, the instant messaging when I was late in high school. So I didn't have Facebook or anything like that. I honestly cannot even imagine what my life would have been like. And it's really hard for me to go back and try and figure out what would have happened. But it's a very tell our listeners about what you're seeing with social media and what we can do, because technology here on Waite Innovate, we're obviously looking for ways to innovate and to use technology to our benefit. But we have to be mindful of some of the negative externalities that are coming from social media. And I'm sure you're seeing that in the realm of mental health.
Yeah, it offers for an easy, quick distraction. I was, brought up with social media. There was the huge wave of iPhones and iPads and things like that. And, I think social media gets a lot of dirt. For me, it's hard to say because it's the reason why I can keep in touch with my mom who's in India, my dad who's in Dubai, my Dubai UAE, my sisters and brothers who are like in other countries, is because of social media. They see my pictures, they know what I'm up to. It helps to minimize checking on each one of us all the time and just seeing how we're doing from maybe a friend's perspective and things like that. So with all that said, social media can be really beneficial in terms of keeping in touch. We talked about isolation, right?
The connection
exactly
factor.
So and I have had a lot of experience where friends have shared something which is concerning to me, and I would message them and say, hey, you shared this, is everything okay? And then they would be like, oh yeah, it's not, because this really resonated with me because this is what I'm going through. So pros and cons. I'm a big advocate that there's multiple dimensions to everything. Yes, of course, there's a lot of negativity. It gives you a lot of distractions, and distractions is huge, and it's a big problem sometimes because it gets you away from the core issue. Again, not to nerd out, but I think that it is. We should start practicing, daily, monitored dosage of social media. I'm not the best at it, far from it, so I can't speak candidly for that. But I do think that that's something that is really, it's everywhere, and it is a problem.
Yeah, and I think admitting you have a problem is the first step. And I did very much the same thing on Nick Dubé's podcast. I admit I'm not the best at social media, and I think we all need to get better. But let's end on a little bit of a happier note. So using social media in a very positive way, we are here breaking some fairly recent news that you have started and launched a really cool Facebook page, immigrant.
Yeah, I am migrant, like a
migrant.
Pun. Yeah, drum roll.
Pun was intended for
Pun
this.
was always, in my case, it's always intended, yeah. One of my, sometimes where I feel at home is when I am with my friends and students who are from, who are international like me. That doesn't mean like not those who are domestic, I don't feel at home with them, but it's just where I'm from. Like I was an international student here, and I still am. I came, from orientation and all those things. So it's where I connect back to. With everything that's happened in terms of the stigma with immigrants and ostracizing and alienating or calling them criminals and things like that, it's been really hurtful. And I've had my own experiences with people saying that to me. And I've had my friends who that got said to. So it has been like that. So it's been there ever since. I mean, there's stigma against immigrants in Dubai, UAE. There's stigma against immigrants here. It's everywhere. So I've always been an immigrant. Something that I came to peace with is that, if there's anything I can do about it is to listen, is to talk to people and figure out how my own privilege plays into place, how I can be a better ally to those who are in from different countries. I was brought up in a Hindu household. I can be an ally. How do I be better with my friends who are Muslim? So that's when this whole thing started. Was I wanted to document people's stories and get them to be comfortable with sharing their own experiences. And then, other people read it, and then many have come up and said, wow, I identify or I relate to this, and this helps and that helps. So it's I would say all the three people that I've interviewed so far, extremely really brave to talk about this in such a candid way in a platform like Facebook, where everything's out there. So I just have them to thank, and I think that I'm just always curious. That's one thing that I think helps.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for our listeners, our viewers, where can they find that? Facebook, type in I'm Migrant.
Product placement, I love it. Yes, thank you so much. It's I am Migrant, so it's I and then M. It spells out as immigrant, and it's a Facebook page. I haven't started using other social media platforms. I'm sure I should, but right now it's more of for me to get we talked about therapy. It's my own way of coming at peace with who I am as an immigrant by listening to others and how they do things.
All right, so check that out. There's so much we could talk about, but I think we both gotta go here. Maybe we'll have to do a follow-up. And yeah, it just making me think about the whole migrant labor issue. Dubai 2022. Are you a football, soccer fan? What's going to happen there?
Yeah, I think there is a problem of I don't necessarily agree with the labor laws and everything that happens there, and how expats who are construction workers and laborers are treated, which is why I basically said, I would like to work in an environment. It doesn't, at least, they're outright about it. It's not a democracy. It's a monarchy, and that's how they've always been. So I have my issues with it. I'm sure you do. I'm sure people who are listening to this do. And I would say that the change can be brought about by, advocating for people. I think advocacy is huge and it's important. And advocacy also starts with listening and not necessarily being the speaker for everybody. So that's huge in Dubai. That's coming up. And I am a little concerned. But from what I can do, I'm trying to do my best like everybody else.
Yeah, very well stated. And for our listeners, just to have a little note, if you want to check out some reporting, I think John Oliver did some really good reporting around this. But yeah, we've got a lot of things to work through. And I think, as Vrinda's saying, let's just have a conversation and work through the issues in a healthy manner. And I guess we'll just end with this. What's next for you? Do you have any parting thoughts? What should our listeners be expecting from Vrinda in the next 3-4 years?
That's a good question. I'm not sure even Vrinda knows. But I think I would just expect to, if I can continue doing this in terms of mental health, in terms of talking to people, advocacy, I think I would be content with that, or satisfied with that. So I want to do that. I want to work with refugees, immigrants, and asylee and asylum seekers. That's what my goal is and has been. And yeah, I'm graduating in 2020, so I can live in my own world for a bit.
Until
there you go.
And so Janet McFetridge has been a guest
Yes.
on the show for Plattsburgh Cares. Have
Yes.
you reached out and worked with them at all?
Yes, I have actually. In undergrad, we were, I was a translator, unofficial translator for them for a bit. And I think they do amazing work. I think there's so many local organizations here that do amazing work, people that do amazing work. A lot of unsung heroes, heroes and heroines and hero people.
Yeah. All right. Very well stated. So thank you so much for joining us, Vrinda.
Thank you so much, Matt.
So
this was great.
We'll try and provide links to our listeners, obviously. I guess the one thing that's pretty obvious is check out the I'm Migrant, Immigrant on Facebook, likely Instagram soon. We'll see.
Yeah.
But yeah, just telling stories of people and just engaging and bringing these issues into the forefront. That's what we're all about here at North Volume. So once again, we want to thank our listeners for joining. Again, please, if we've got an ask, it's like, share, comment, review, rate. The more that we're having these conversations in the community, the more impactful it's going to be. So please check us out on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, viewers. If you're interested in sponsoring a Waite Innovate, we're hoping to keep this going, and we are very positive about the direction we're going with. So just reach out to Neil. That's neil@northvolume.com. And we're looking forward to having everyone back for episode 54 of Waite Innovate, only on North Volume.